Settle in, everybody. This is going to be a bit of a long haul. As most of you know, I'm a pretty big fan of NASA's Space Shuttle program. Over the years, I've learned a lot about it, but very recently, I was reminded that there's still a lot of things I don't know. While preparing my video about crazy and true shuttle stories, someone showed me this meme, the Space Shuttle and its derivatives iceberg made by Levi Ohana. It's a detailed breakdown of things some people know about the shuttle, and many things that most people are completely oblivious to. Today, we're going to go through and explain every item on this iceberg. But in typical fashion, we must first do some housekeeping. The first thing to explain, if you're unaware of it, is the iceberg format itself. I've done one video of it already, a self-made flat Earth iceberg, but to put it simply, an iceberg is a way of showing how deep and obscure knowledge of any specific subject can go. A prime example is Wendigoon's Iceberg of Disturbing Movies, which begins with box-standard horror movies like The Evil Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, things everybody knows about, but ends with literal snuff films off the dark web that only freaks like me know about. The purpose is to mimic an iceberg's nature of hiding most of its bulk below the water, showing that what people see on the surface of any subject is only a tiny taste of what there actually is to that subject. Second, I want to talk about the term derivatives. When we're talking about the shuttle, we often use the term SDLV, or Shuttle Derived Launch Vehicle. A shuttle derivative, or SDLV, is a launch vehicle that has architecture or hardware directly influenced by the design of the space shuttle. Some SDLVs find their way into the real world. For instance, NASA's Space Launch System is an SDLV, as most of its components are derived from the shuttle. It uses the same RS-25 main engines, an extended version of the space shuttle's solid rocket boosters, and its core stage is heavily influenced by the design of the shuttle's external fuel tank. Ares 1X was another real SDLV, used to test the Orion spacecraft during the Constellation program, as it used a space shuttle solid rocket booster for the first stage and a simplified RS-25 engine for the second stage. However, the only launch test vehicle did not include this proposed second stage. Despite these two, there are a mountain of SDLVs that never made it off of paper, and many of those will be discussed today. So now you know what I mean when I repeatedly say the words derivative or SDLV during this video. One more quick thing. Because I consider myself knowledgeable but recognize that I too have many knowledge gaps, I'm going to specify which of these items I knew about previously and which ones I learned about in order to make this video. Now that we're through that, let's dive into this iceberg, shall we? Strap in, face forward, and brace for main engine start. I'm going to be honest here. Despite this level having only 3 items, I somewhat disagree with it being what is known by the general public. The general public knows very little about the space shuttle. Many aren't aware that it was retired in 2011, that there were 2 fatal disasters, that Shuttle Enterprise even exists, or remember that the Mir space station even existed. Nevertheless, let's go through each of these items. Enterprise was supposed to go to space. As I said, I doubt many even remember the atmospheric test vehicle that was OV-101 Shuttle Enterprise, named by the public after a poll in honor of the iconic Star Trek flagship. Of course I remembered it, and I did know that it was supposed to go to space. The original plan had been to modify Shuttle Enterprise after her test flights, giving her a heat shield and engines, and make her the second space-rated orbiter in service. However, during the construction of OV-102, Shuttle Columbia, a number of details of the shuttle's design had changed, making it more cost-effective to build Shuttle Challenger around a second unused test article's frame. Similarly, after the Challenger disaster, Enterprise was again considered for refitting, but once more, the more cost-effective option was to build Shuttle Endeavour. Speaking of the Challenger disaster, I don't know how common it is to know that engineers responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket booster explicitly told NASA not to launch on the date of Challenger's final flight. They explained that the extrusion process, in which the rubber O-rings would become heated and shift in their groove to form a seal in the booster's casing, was not guaranteed to work in the projected extra low temperatures of the launch date. However, NASA was being pressured to keep a high launch cadence for the shuttle program, and they caved to political pressure, launching Challenger to its doom in January of 1986. Shuttle docked to Mir. In my opinion, the public memory of space stations is occupied solely by the International Space Station. Most simply don't remember the Russian Mir station, much less the earlier Skylab or Salyut stations. As a result, some may be surprised to learn about the collaborative 11-mission Shuttle Mir program, in which the NASA shuttle visited the Russian station to transfer crew and supplies, as well as exchange knowledge about the growing subject of long-duration spaceflight. After Shuttle Discovery performed the first rendezvous and came within 37 feet of the Russian station, Shuttle Atlantis docked to Mir 7 times, while Discovery and Endeavour both docked once. Despite displaying that characteristic spirit of cooperation in space, the Shuttle Mir program was criticized heavily, mostly out of concerns with the aging Mir. The station suffered a fire in 1997, and in the same year suffered a collision with a Progress supply vessel that had caused an entire module to be permanently sealed off for the rest of the station's life. One other thing I'd like to mention regarding Mir is that a different spaceplane was originally supposed to visit it. I'm going to add Buran to this iceberg because it absolutely counts as an SDLV. If you didn't know, Buran was a shuttle-like orbiter that used the Energia launch system and was planned to dock with the Mir, but Buran was cancelled after the fall of the Soviet Union after only one uncrewed test flight. Instead, Mir would be visited by the NASA shuttle. So, that's what we have for the general public level of the Shuttle Iceberg. Just a few fun facts. Let's descend a little lower. Now we get a little more obscure. Actually, a lot more obscure. You may be familiar with the naming scheme of the Space Shuttle flights. STS, standing for Space Transportation System, followed by a number. For a brief period of time, it used a naming scheme based on the fiscal year that included a letter after the number, such as STS-61A or STS-41D. However, have you ever heard of STS-300 or STS-400? These were the designations for NASA's contingency missions, officially called Launch on Need missions. These were rescue missions that would have been mounted if another mission's vehicle was damaged and deemed unable to make a safe return to Earth. One might be wondering why such a mission wasn't initiated when Space Shuttle Columbia was in orbit for STS-107 with a hole in her wing, and the answer is simple. These contingency missions were planned after the loss of Columbia. The rescue missions had several pieces of specific hardware to be flown, including extra seats, extra handholds, mounting provisions for the cooling units of extra spacesuits, mounting provisions for a cable that could be used to transfer crew, in addition to a remote control orbiter cable that could be used to deorbit the damaged shuttle without a crew aboard. STS-400 was a similar contingency mission, though it was a very specific flight intended to rescue Shuttle Atlantis on a Hubble servicing mission using Shuttle Endeavour, because on that flight, Atlantis would have no way to reach the International Space Station as a safe haven. The STS-3 White Sands landing. Some may know that the Space Shuttle almost exclusively used two runways for its landings, one at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida,
Skipper's gear is down and locked. Main gear touchdown. The nose of the shuttle being rotated down toward the flight deck. The parachute being deployed.
And one at Edwards Air Force Base in California.
Landing gear down and locked. Main gear touchdown. Kevin Ford now deploying the drag chute. Nose gear touchdown.
It used these sites for 132 out of 133 landings, with the one exception being Space Shuttle Columbia's third test flight, STS-3, which landed on the dry lake bed of runway 17 of the White Sands Test Facility in New Mexico. The unexpectedly difficult landing and post-flight conditions left the shuttle severely damaged, and she required extensive repair before flying her final test flight. Another unexpected side effect had been the gypsum dust that had managed to work its way into every nook and cranny of Shuttle Columbia's exterior. Astronaut Charles Bolden stated that he recalled getting into orbit 4 flights later on STS-61C and still finding dust floating around them despite 4 rounds in the shuttle processing facility. As a matter of fact, the gypsum dust remained embedded in Columbia for the remainder of her life, and it's morbid to think about it, but there is likely even more dust from New Mexico scattered over her final landing zone in East Texas. Challenger was a converted STA, or Shuttle Test Article. We sort of covered this already. Shuttle Challenger was commissioned to be the second orbiter of the fleet when it was realized that converting Enterprise into an operational vehicle was going to be way too costly. Too much had changed in the design between Enterprise and Columbia, and to again save on costs, Challenger was constructed around the frame of an unfinished test article. In fact, the test article had been left unfinished intentionally, leaving it open to be converted into a flight vehicle if needed. This is part of the reason that Shuttle Challenger has the orbiter designation of OV-099. The near miss of STS-27. In 1988, Shuttle Atlantis experienced a launch anomaly that would dreadfully foreshadow the later loss of STS-107. Some ablative material from one of the nose caps of the solid rocket boosters broke off and struck the orbiter's thermal protection tiles. Once in orbit, the crew's cameras aboard the Canadarm weren't high resolution enough to fully assess the damage, and this problem was compounded by the fact that they were forced to use a slow, poor-quality encrypted transmission method with ground control due to the mission being a classified DoD flight. Mission Control seemed unconcerned, and engineers even remarked that the damage was actually just, quote, lights and shadows. They stated that there would be no concern for re-entry. The crew, believing the damage to be much more severe, were, quote, infuriated, and Mission Commander Robert Gibson stated that if he saw signs of re-entry going south, he planned to, quote, tell Mission Control what I thought of their analysis in the final moments before his death. STS-27 would re-enter and land safely, but the damage was extremely extensive. Over 700 tiles were damaged, and one tile was missing altogether. This missing tile was located over an aluminum mounting plate for an antenna, and this metal plate absorbing the heat was likely the only thing that prevented a burn-through that would have destroyed the entire orbiter. STS-27 came very close to being lost, and unfortunately, this is not the only time I'll say these words during this video. The United Space Alliance. Some might wonder, who looked after the space shuttle? Who was in charge of maintaining the fleet? The United Space Alliance is who. Formed as a joint venture between Rockwell International and Lockheed Martin, who built most of the shuttle, the USA, what a name, was created to operate and maintain the shuttle fleet, as well as do work for mission design, planning, astronaut and flight controller training, software development, flight operations, vehicle processing, and much more. This work was hampered severely when the shuttle program ended in 2011, and the USA sought new business opportunities through other NASA programs, supporting the Constellation program and the Ares 1 launch vehicle. However, when Constellation was cancelled, the USA began to wind down. As of 2014, they had no active contracts and stated they would not pursue future contracts, though they were performing contract closeout requirements. On December 20th, 2019, the United Space Alliance was officially dissolved. Shuttle Centaur. You may be familiar with the Centaur upper stage, a United Launch Alliance rocket used primarily to propel heavy payloads from a parking orbit to an injection burn with another planetary body. Centaur has been famously used on the Viking program, NASA's first Mars landing program, the Voyager probes, the Cassini-Huygens probe, and much more. It is noteworthy for being a powerful and efficient rocket that allows for heavier deep space payloads that can be launched on trajectories that will get them to other planets much faster than with other upper stages. The Centaur upper stage has been used on the Atlas and Titan rockets exclusively, though a new one will be used on ULA's upcoming Vulcan rocket. However, did you know that a Centaur variant had been designed to be used on the space shuttle? Two variants were actually developed. One would deliver the Galileo and Ulysses probes to Jupiter, and another would deliver the Magellan probe to Venus, as well as be used with DoD Milstar communications satellites. This upper stage would allow for Galileo and Ulysses to reach Jupiter much sooner, prolonging their operational lifetime. The process of launching a shuttle Centaur was complex. 2 missions were scheduled with 1-hour launch windows 6 days apart, needing 2 orbiters and 2 launch pads. The main engines were to be run at 109% of the original design thrust to compensate for the extra weight of the hefty Centaur. Because Centaur runs on hydrolox, a cryogenic fuel, it would occasionally need to vent hydrogen, which required special modifications to allow for. This fuel also meant the payloads needed to be deployed on the first day in orbit, demanding 4-member veteran crews that were not known to suffer from space adaptation syndrome, basically the space version of seasickness. However, neither variant of the Centaur would fly on the shuttle, despite both Atlantis and Challenger being modified to carry the integrated support system that would hold Centaur in the payload bay. It even went so far as to have the first Centaur G upper stage roll out from the General Dynamics factory in San Diego in August of 1985. Here it is arriving at the Shuttle Payload Integration Facility at KSC. It was certified to be flight ready in November of 1985. However, just 1 month later, Shuttle Challenger was lost in the fatal disaster of STS-51L, and despite this being unrelated to the issue, this occurred just after Challenger's main engines were throttled up to 104% power. This led to a faulty perception at Johnson and Marshall that it would be too risky to use 109% power for Shuttle Centaur, and without that extra push, it was doubtful that the shuttle would be able to loft Centaur into orbit at all. With the increased aversion to risk that permeated the post-Challenger shuttle era, Shuttle Centaur would be cancelled. Galileo and Ulysses would be launched with the far less powerful inertial upper stage, needing to use gravitational assists from Venus and Earth to reach Jupiter. Vandenberg SLC-6. Pretty much any spaceflight enthusiast is probably familiar with NASA's West Coast launch site, Vandenberg Launch Complex 6, which allows for launches into polar or near-polar orbits, useful for many payloads, especially military satellites. The famously foggy launch site is home to its own unique vehicle assembly building, launch pad, and other amenities. It is most frequently used by United Launch Alliance when they deliver National Reconnaissance Office satellites via the Delta IV Heavy or the Atlas V. However, you may not know that SLC-6 was originally built to launch the Space Shuttle. Well, sort of. In actuality, it was originally developed for the Titan IIIM rocket, but these were cancelled while the launch site was still being constructed. It was left unused for a few years, but in 1972 was chosen as the Western launch site for Air Force shuttle launches. Use was approved in 1975, and construction resumed from 1979 to 1986. There were a number of considerations to be taken when using the launch site. First, polar launches require more fuel expenditure, as Eastern launches are assisted by the Coriolis effect, and as a result, polar shuttle launches would entail a very hefty payload penalty. Launches also necessitated overflying South Carolina during ascent, and the discarded external tank would overfly both Russia and Canada. However, the Air Force insisted that expenditures at SLC-6 were justified for the ability to launch high-priority military payloads into polar orbit, and added that the partially constructed architecture allowed for reduced costs when building the shuttle complex. $4 billion were poured into SLC-6, modifying the service tower for the shuttle's boosters, as well as adding hydrolock storage tanks, a payload preparation and changeout room, a new launch tower for crew, sound suppression systems, and the shuttle assembly building. In 1984 and 1985, Orbiter Enterprise was mated with an external tank and boosters at SLC-6 to perform fit checks, and the complex was declared operational in October of 1985, despite more work still needing to be done. The first flight, STS-62A with Shuttle Discovery, was planned for July of 1986. However, like many things, the Challenger disaster pushed SLC-6 to the back burner due to safety concerns from the Air Force in the overly cautious post-Challenger era, and the shuttle program at Vandenberg was cancelled in 1989. Space Shuttle Endeavour was made of spare parts. Well, knowing how cost-focused the shuttle program tried to be, this shouldn't be too surprising. We already talked about the question of which was cheaper, refit Enterprise for flight, or build a whole new orbiter. The new orbiter was chosen, and Endeavour was planned as early as 1986. To further cut down on costs, Endeavour was constructed largely from a cache of structural spares that had been produced during the construction of Discovery and Atlantis. Assembly was completed in 1990, and Endeavour flew for the first time in 1992 on STS-49. And that is the second tier. Now, as we begin to descend below the surface and into the third tier, you may realize the understatement of the century. Space Shuttle lore goes deep. I find it somewhat funny that not only does the average space nerd category include things I had never heard of when I would have considered myself an average space nerd, but the image also includes Scott Manley, an everyday astronaut? I definitely wouldn't consider them average space nerds either. Maybe it's supposed to refer to people who watch that kind of content. Oh, and Elon's there too, I guess, whatever. STS-93 and the Golden Bullet. This was another near miss for the program, but nowhere near as bad as Atlantis' tile damage on STS-27. On this launch, Space Shuttle Columbia's main engines ignited, and a gold pin that was used to plug an oxidizer post in the number 3 engine came loose, striking the inside of the nozzle at supersonic speeds and tearing open 3 cooling tubes containing hydrogen. A hydrogen leak began upstream of the main combustion chamber. Despite all of this, the shuttle's flight computer said, "This is fine," and proceeded to lift off normally. However, 5 seconds after liftoff, an electrical short disabled primary digital control units for both the center and right engine, leaving them to operate on their remaining third DCU.
All up, 3104.
In a row, we've got
Flag,
a fuel
lost
cell
controller,
number 1.
lost DCU-A on the center, DCU-B on the left. And AC buttons off,
No action on the fuel
other
cell.
two AC.
Flight booster lost control redundancy, lost center engine A, right engine B looks like something on AC1.
The factor of redundancy here undoubtedly saved Columbia and her crew from catastrophe, as the shutdown of 2 engines 5 seconds into flight would have led to an extremely risky contingency abort procedure, and quite frankly, none of the shuttle's abort procedures are very good options. ET-94. We'll talk more about the different models of shuttle external fuel tanks later, but ET-94 was one of 3 lightweight tanks ordered specifically to support Columbia's science missions. These were the last of this type of ET used, and the first of these, ET-93, was the one launched on STS-107, which was the last flight of Columbia. As a result, ET-94 was studied extensively after the disaster, but never used, and is the only existing fuel tank that was constructed for a flight. It is currently on display at the California Science Center. STS-51F Abort to Orbit. Speaking of shuttle abort modes, the abort to orbit option was available when the intended orbit could not be achieved, but a stable orbit was still possible. The orbiter would then either carry out its mission at a lower than intended altitude, or return to Earth to try again another time. This abort mode was used exactly once, on STS-51F in 1985. This flight was one using the Spacelab Mobile Laboratory, and famously featured specially designed Coca-Cola and Pepsi cans, officially as an experiment to bring carbonated beverages to space, but really just as a publicity stunt. Oh, and it had an infrared helium-cooled telescope capable of collecting data on 60% of the galactic plane, I guess, but whatever. The more nerd-famous aspect of this mission is that around 5.5 minutes into the ascent, 2 of the center engine's temperature sensors failed and the engine shut down. The only instance of an RS-25 shutdown in the entire program.
Altitude 58 nautical miles, distance downrange 275 nautical miles, velocity 11,000 feet per second.
Read copy, stand by.
Flight Fido abort ATO. Abort ATO.
We have a center engine down.
Abort ATO. Abort ATO.
Mission Control, Houston, we have a center engine down on the Challenger. The crew has been instructed to abort to orbit.
Near the end of the ascent, a sensor on the right engine similarly failed, and Booster Systems engineer Jenny Howard acted quickly, ordering the crew to stop further automatic shutdowns and an abort mode that was extremely dangerous.
Sensor problems. We've failed another sensor. I'm tempted to go inhibit it. I know there's single engine capability.
Are we past Hale, Fido?
Yes, we are, Flight.
Limits to inhibit.
Challenger, Houston, main engine limits to inhibit.
Okay, inhibit.
Instead, the shuttle performed an abort to orbit and used the remaining engines to push the shuttle into an orbit around 120 kilometers lower than intended. However, the mission was, technically, still a success. Hey, remember Vandenberg? While it never got the chance to launch a shuttle, a piece of it specifically meant to launch the shuttle did manage to survive. In 2014, the orbiter transporter system built to ferry the shuttle around at Vandenberg was purchased by SpaceX, for a steal, by the way. They bought the vehicle at a federal surplus auction for $37,075 US. They now use it to transport the reusable first stage of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, and it seems fitting that this crawler managed to continue on in the spirit of reusable spaceflight that it was originally designed to facilitate in the first place. Classified missions. We've touched on this with STS-27, but the Space Shuttle flew a number of missions for the Department of Defense, which means there's limited information regarding exactly what was done on these flights. Though this sounds mysterious, the most likely truth is that the shuttle was simply launching spy satellites. The shuttle performed a total of 10 classified DoD flights, and as time has gone on, amateur astronomers have worked out what a number of the payloads most likely were, and this has been aided by some of the black bars being removed from documents over the years. It might be interesting to note that a common spy satellite that the shuttle may have launched is the KH-11, which may look somewhat familiar to you. It is indeed believed that the design of the KH-11 is inspired by the Hubble Space Telescope. Columbia's Silts Pod. Take a look at OV-102, Space Shuttle Columbia. Now let's take a look at, say, OV-104, Space Shuttle Atlantis. There's a number of differences, perhaps the most obvious being Columbia's iconic black shines, but a more subtle one to the average observer is the tail fin. Do you see it? That bulbous thing at the top of Columbia's fin is the Silts Pod, or Shuttle Infrared Lee-Side Temperature Sensor. It was installed after STS-9 to acquire infrared and thermal data on the orbiter during ascent and re-entry. Initial tests found the information it gathered to be insufficient, and the equipment was removed, but the pod remained for the rest of Columbia's life. In an ironic twist of fate, the Silts Pod was specifically designed to examine re-entry effects on the orbiter's left wing, an area that would eventually be the cause of its demise. The 3-foot twang. Personally, I would have put this on the second tier because for basically any shuttle fan, the twang is iconic. When the shuttle launched, it would first ignite the main engines on the orbiter, which is itself located on the side of the external fuel tank. This ignition would shift the weight of the entire stack, which would pitch forward in the direction of the orbiter's underside, about 3 feet. On every launch, you can see this happen, and reportedly, the astronauts could feel this happen. As a result of the twang, in addition to giving time for the main engines to fully power up, the launch system had to wait a moment for it to settle back into a fully vertical position before the boosters ignite and she blasted off the pad. STS-51L Big Bird. This is a weird one. Some of you may know about this thanks to Alternate History Hub's video What If Big Bird Exploded in the Challenger Disaster, which he rightly describes as his most tasteless video ever. Many know that STS-51L was the intended start of the Teacher in Space program, having civilian teacher Krista McAuliffe on board. However, most don't know that before the Teacher in Space program was approved, there were other options on the table. One of those options was to launch Big Bird from Sesame Street on the shuttle. The idea never went past a short discussion at a round table. The intention was to literally launch the suit actor while wearing the suit, so the logistics of doing so quickly proved to be absurd to say the least. It never happened, and it probably never would have happened, but in the end, NASA managed to traumatize thousands of children anyway. And that is my tasteless joke of the video. I am sorry. Shuttle C. Finally, we're getting into some weird territory. Before I tell you what Shuttle C is, I'll just show you what it is. Look at that funky thing. If the shuttle was a stripped-down airplane, Shuttle C is a stripped-down airplane to a point where it's just a cargo bay and engines. The idea was to create an uncrewed cargo launcher that was single-use, yet significantly cut development costs for a heavy launch vehicle by reusing the existing architecture. Making them single-use and crew-free meant lower maintenance and safety requirements, and those meant higher flight rates, one of the original goals that the shuttle itself never quite managed to achieve. The Shuttle C study was developed far enough to include a full-scale mock-up at Marshall Space Flight Center, but the proposal was set aside when George W. Bush called for an end to the shuttle program by 2010. Liquid booster concepts. This I consider to be slightly more common knowledge than one might think. Most people know that the shuttle used 2 boosters fueled by solid propellant, as opposed to the liquid propellant that was used for the main engines. Many are also aware that during the design phase, solid fuel was not the only option. There were a number of shuttle concepts that used liquid-fueled boosters, and these concepts would continue even after the final shuttle design had been approved. The reasons for the debate are varied. Solid boosters are seen as reliable, simple, and relatively cheap, while liquid boosters are seen as more powerful and more efficient, while more expensive and tricky to work with. In the end, NASA went with the solid design to put focus on reusing the main engines instead. Hey, did you know that the space shuttle was capable of landing itself? Kinda, in a way, not really? Hang on, let me back up. The shuttle did in fact have an automatic landing program that could, theoretically, put her down safely on the runway. Part of the issue with testing it was that if it went wrong, it was a very expensive and a potentially deadly mistake. On final approach, the space shuttle is a very heavy glider. It has no ability to perform powered flight in the atmosphere. Therefore, if the automatic landing were to fail, there is no doing a go-around. The shuttle would crash, be destroyed or sustain heavy damage, and the crew would be injured or most likely killed. Despite all of this risk, there was one flight that made an almost automatic landing. STS-3 allowed the program to perform lineup, final approach, and pre-flare maneuvers, and then the pilot would take over and complete the landing. Here was the result of that. It was immediately decided to discontinue the automatic landing system. The last flight of Shuttle Enterprise. As you know, Enterprise was a test vehicle intended to perform atmospheric flights lofted by a carrier aircraft before separating and gliding back to a runway. On her 5th and final test flight, Enterprise revealed the problem of pilot-induced oscillation, which is essentially unstable controls caused by overcorrection of pilot commands. This was in 1977, but the true final landing of Shuttle Enterprise occurred surprisingly in 2012, when she landed at JFK in New York on the back of the 747 shuttle carrier aircraft. Shuttle Enterprise remains in New York to this day on the Intrepid Museum. STS-1 body flap overpressure. The first orbital test flight of the space shuttle required absolute balls of steel, because it was such an ambitious and brand new launch system, and problems on a first flight of such a vehicle was inevitable. One such problem was the overpressure wave from the solid rocket booster, effectively caused by launching too fast through the thicker parts of the atmosphere. This overpressure damaged the orbiter's heat shield, caused a forward RCS oxidizer strut to fail, and forced the orbiter's body flap into an angle well beyond the point where it should have cracked or ruptured its hydraulics. Such damage would have made the orbiter lose control during its descent, and John Young would later admit that, had he known about this, they would have ejected out of Columbia with the special seats installed for the test flight, causing Columbia to be lost on her very first flight. However, they didn't know, and the flap remained miraculously intact, allowing them to safely pilot Columbia to the ground.
30, 20, 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, touchdown now. Those gears, 10 feet. 5, 4, those gears coming. 3, touchdown. Those count the ball, skipper.
Since this is the only time I'm going to talk much about STS-1 on this iceberg, I'd also like to add one other little tidbit to this. Despite the immense stress of being the crew of the only spacecraft to ever make a debut flight with people aboard, John Young's heart rate didn't climb above 90 beats per minute for the entire ascent.
And that good old Columbia landed about 1,200 feet further down the runway than we thought it would based on the tile, because we had a lift-to-drag ratio of, instead of 4.45, we had 4.9. It was awesome.
STS-70 woodpeckers. This was the first item I had genuinely never heard of, and found information about it through a number of sources, including directly through people who worked on the shuttle program. STS-70 was the final of 7 deployments of the Tracking Data and Relight satellite system, and Discovery was rolled out to Pad 39B on the 11th of May. 3 weeks later, engineers were called to the pad to observe the most bizarre thing to ever attack the space shuttle. 71 deep holes in the external tank's foam insulation caused by a northern flicker, which had attempted to make a home in what it believed was a tree. The 71 holes eventually became 205, and the launch stack was rolled back to the VAB. NASA tried everything to keep the birds away for the next attempt. They used loud horns to scare them, predator eye balloons, plastic owls. Reportedly, their success was mixed at best, but they managed to launch after the first scrub anyway. Following that, the mating season of the northern flicker was over, and the shuttle was safe from the menacing birds. Direct/Jupiter rockets. The second item I was unfamiliar with. I had heard the names, but didn't really know what they were until today. Now we're getting more into SDLVs with this and Shuttle C. Direct was a proposed alternative super heavy lift launch architecture that was created to replace the agency's planned Ares series of rockets with its Jupiter series for the Constellation program. It aimed to make heavy use of space shuttle hardware to reduce costs and bridge the gap between the shuttle's retirement and the first launch of Orion. Its core stage would use a tank closely based on the existing shuttle external fuel tank, a pair of shuttle solid rocket boosters, and up to 4 RS-25 main engines. Wait a moment, this sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, it basically did end up happening, but it was a long road to get there. The original fully shuttle-derived design was changed to take away the RS-25s and replace them with RS-68s, the engines used on the ULA Delta IV family of rockets. By the third proposal, Direct returned to recommending RS-25 engines, relying on its experience to outweigh its higher cost. After Constellation was cancelled, President Obama signed the NASA Authorization Act of 2010, and a portion of this act mandated work begin on the development of the Space Launch System, or SLS. At this point, the team behind Direct declared that their goal had been achieved, and they disbanded. STS-2 Manual Reentry. There's a reason the word manual is in quotes. STS-1 had been a test of the automatic deorbit guidance systems of the shuttle, and when these had succeeded, STS-2 was cleared to explore the stability margins of Columbia's performance during reentry. Commander Joe Engle, making use of his past experience as an X-15 pilot, performed a number of maneuvers that had been planned ahead of time, as well as manually performing the first roll maneuver, as there had been an anomaly when STS-1 automatically performed the same roll. In fact, the previous flight was the only reason Engle had to take control at all. The maneuvers he performed were the ones that the software nerds hadn't finished rewriting yet, as a lot of adjustment was made after STS-1. So not exactly manual reentry, but more assisted automated reentry. External tank weight. The second thing I didn't really know about before making this video. Throughout the shuttle program, changes were being made to the shuttle's external fuel tank. Because it was the only element of the launch system that was fully discarded, it was much easier to alter them in subtle ways between flights. There were two major ways the ET was modified over the years. safety, and weight. As foam shedding continued to be a problem for damaging shuttles and would eventually doom Columbia, the ET was constantly being modified to replace the high-risk foam sections. As for weight, the efforts were constant and varied. After STS-2, they stopped painting the tank white, saving 600 pounds. Next, they removed the anti-geyser line and saved another few hundred pounds. This line reduced accumulation of gaseous oxygen, but was again shown to be unnecessary, so off it went. With STS-6, the lightweight tank was introduced, used for the majority of the program. These had further reduced weight by eliminating portions of structural stiffeners that weren't needed, modifying the frames of the hydrogen tank, and milling the tank differently so that it was physically thinner and lighter. Next, on STS-91, the super lightweight tank was introduced, which switched to a different aluminum-lithium alloy, saving 7,000 pounds, and was specifically designed to facilitate larger payloads to the ISS. Tier 3 complete, everyone. It's getting exciting now. Let's go deeper. The Challenger Atlantis body flap. Another thing I didn't know about. Early in the program in 1984, Challenger had a problem with her body flap needing to have several tiles repaired and replaced. In order to keep Challenger flying, they swapped the flap out with the one for Atlantis, and Challenger's was repaired, then placed on Atlantis. From all sources I can find, they were never switched back, and Challenger carried Atlantis' body flap up until STS-51L in 1986. What this also means, interestingly enough, is that a piece of Challenger survived all the way to the end of the shuttle program and remains to this day at the Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex, still mounted on Shuttle Atlantis. MPTA 098, otherwise known as the Space Shuttle Main Propulsion Test Article, is a funky little thing. Built in 1977, it consisted of the back portion of a space shuttle fuselage as well as a truss structure. It was used to test the space shuttle main engine design, working out the kinks before they began mounting the engines on actual orbiters. Failures during development meant the test article was frequently damaged and repaired, and then in 1981, after the shuttles actually began to launch, the MPTA went dormant. It sat unused for 7 years until it was used to conduct fit checks for the Shuttle C mock-up in 1988. Today, the MPTA, without its trust work, sits in the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Now, I need to make a slight correction to this iceberg. It's not Space Shuttle Resolution, it's Space Shuttle Resolution with an exclamation mark. It's like SLC Punk. This is a bit of a sad story. Chuck Ryan, an aerospace enthusiast from a young age, would eventually work for Cal Poly in the 1990s, and during this time, formed a club for promoting the goals of NASA. At some point, NASA donated an old motion simulator to Cal Poly, and Ryan and the club used this simulator to basically just pretend they were on the space shuttle. They mounted a TV to it, showing footage of shuttle launches from a cockpit POV, built a console that produced recordings from actual launches, and at some point, Ryan had the idea of building a full mock-up of a space shuttle crew compartment. And he did it, naming it Resolution, and building with a group of around 10 people out of donated woods and metals. The construction process had many twists and turns and is kind of a whole story unto itself. It was moved around a lot after it was completed, eventually ending up outside the south gate of the Kennedy Space Center. It isn't in very good shape anymore and appears to have been abandoned by someone with a dream who never quite got to realize it. STS-33 toilet depressurization. Oh yeah, now this is the good stuff. On STS-33 in 1989, Shuttle Discovery encountered an unusual problem when the mission commander woke up on Thanksgiving Day. He used the shuttle's toilet, which is a complicated process unto itself. Essentially, the toilet has a kind of airlock within it. One opens the first valve, deposits their waste, closes the first valve, turns on a fan to shift the waste to the bottom, then opens a valve to expose the inner compartment to space. This freeze dries it, and it remains there until the shuttle is refurbished. However, this time, the first valve didn't close when it was supposed to, and when Commander Frederick Gregory opened the flush valve, the entire room was exposed to space. He felt the air rushing between his legs, and an alarm went off that woke up the rest of the crew. Mission Specialist Story Musgrave came to the rescue, helping Gregory wrestle the inner valve closed, and for the remainder of the mission, the crew were forced to, use bags. As a matter of fact, the same kind of bags the Apollo astronauts used. Exploration, Production, and Operations Contract. This contract was awarded to a Boeing Northrop Grumman joint venture for the NASA Space Launch System in 2022, shifting operation of the SLS rocket to that venture rather than NASA themselves. Effectively, this not only guarantees further SLS launches for basically the next 50 years, but it's also, in a way, a rebirth of the United Space Alliance. there's not much to say about it except that in some manner of speaking, the USA is still alive. Commercial Crew Shuttle with Endeavour and Atlantis. You may be familiar with NASA's current Commercial Crew program, which is the new program that allows for crewed transport in the era of the shuttle's retirement. Primarily, it utilizes the SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft, but also intends to use Sierra Nevada's Dream Chaser and Boeing Starliner spacecrafts. The brief period of time in which the commercial crew contracts were up for grabs was a vicious time of business warfare, with two newcomers coming out on top alongside a more incumbent Boeing. However, one suggestion, coming of course from the United Space Alliance, was to not fix what wasn't broken. They proposed utilizing shuttles Endeavour and Atlantis as commercial crew vehicles, and this notion was roundly rejected. As much as I love the space shuttle, it is a vehicle designed in the 1970s. It's remarkable that it flew all the way until 2011. High Energy Upper Stage. I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure why this one is on here, because there's virtually no information on it. The creator of this iceberg refers to it as a high-energy hypergolic upper stage, meaning it was liquid-fueled unlike the solid-fueled inertial upper stage, but beyond that, the only time the phrase high energy is attached to an upper stage is when referring to Centaur, and we've already discussed that. I do know that the inertial upper stage was one of several candidates for deep space probe delivery systems, and that some proposals were liquid-fueled, but I don't know if any of them actually are this aforementioned high-energy upper stage. It turns out my suspicions were correct. While editing this video, I realized that high energy upper stage does in fact refer to the Centaur upper stage. That's what it was called during early planning before being given its mythology-inspired name. 2 Out Blue. This is the shuttle option you never ever want to experience, and thankfully, no one ever actually did. 2 Out Blue refers to a scenario during the shuttle's return to launch site abort option, which involved quite literally flipping the orbiter over, bleeding off speed, and then putting it on a trajectory to return to the launch site. If, during this crazy maneuver, a second engine went out, that was called 2 Out Blue.
So we think we have a second engine down. Booster?
Left in, right engine out.
Need to push Capcom. We concur the left engine's out.
Left in, right engine down.
Need to push. We concur the left and right engine's down. 2 Out Blue, fine. Need the push button. Need the push button, 2 engine out blue. You're in the 2 engine out blue. We need the push buttons.
When this happens, the shuttle can't maintain its weight and will begin to drop like a stone. Because of this, the external tank would be dropped, and the shuttle will not be able to reach a runway. The crew would be forced to bail out of the orbiter before it crashed into the ocean. However, thankfully, as stated, the RTLS abort option, referred to by some as a, quote, unnatural act of physics, never needed to be attempted on a real flight. Enterprise Space Station. You may have heard of Space Station Freedom, the concept station that was eventually replaced by the International Space Station. In the late 80s and early 90s, there were a number of creative ideas to create a large modular orbiting laboratory, many of which were simply variants of the Freedom Station itself. One of the more unique proposals, however, involved launching Space Shuttle Enterprise into a permanent orbit after removing her flight components and keeping her external tank attached. This was essentially a more permanent version of the shuttle's Space Lab missions, as the tank could be converted over time into a habitable module of its own. However, like many of NASA's more unique ideas, it never came to fruition. As we already know, Enterprise would never go to space. Except on Star Trek. The Ares 1 roller coaster. I like that we're now getting into NASA's goofier ideas. Ares 1, as you know, would have been the first crewed vehicle in the Constellation program, and a very unique escape option was conceived in case of an on-the-pad emergency. Build a roller coaster to very quickly ride down the launch tower into a bunker. It may sound a little silly, but frankly, a roller coaster is a very good way to get from 280 feet in the air to the ground in less than 20 seconds. However, as Constellation was cancelled, the roller coaster was too. You must be this well funded in order to ride? Is that something? SLS the next 100 years. God, I hope not. Another item that I'm not quite sure why it's on this list because it's just kind of a meme. It comes from a poster that hangs somewhere in the Marshall Space Flight Center, implying that the Space Launch System will be used to explore Mars and beyond for the next century. Which, doubt. Spaceflight technology needs to move forward, and as cool as SLS is, it doesn't do very much of that. Note that the boosters on the poster have the same outdated 2014 paint job, which can be found on my International Space Rockets poster that I have in my room, which also lists Falcon Heavy as in development. They never ended up painting the boosters like that. The shuttle's drag chute is a somewhat iconic part of the landing process. People tend to know the order of events: wheels out, main gear down, drag chute out, forward gear down. However, it wasn't always this way. In fact, the drag chute wasn't introduced until 1992 on STS-49, the maiden flight of Space Shuttle Endeavour.
Landing gear down. Main gear touchdown. Nose gear touchdown. Drag chute deploy as Endeavour completed its maiden flight, rolling out on runway number 22.
Prior flights tended to suffer severely from tire and landing gear damage, especially when dealing with events like crosswinds. On STS-51D, Discovery endured seized brakes and a burst tire during a crosswinds landing, and with the introduction of Endeavour came the introduction of the drag chute to assist in slowing the orbiter down after the main gear hit the runway at around 225 miles per hour. Enterprise wing strike. We talked earlier about Shuttle Enterprise's final flight aboard the carrier aircraft to JFK, but we didn't talk about the struggles between JFK to the Intrepid. She was transported up the Hudson River, and at one point, a strong gust of wind blew Enterprise's wing into a railroad bridge which, according to ABC News, caused only, quote, cosmetic damage. She reached Intrepid safely, but just months after going on display, an intense storm hit the region. Enterprise was safe inside of her pressurized pavilion on the Intrepid, but after the storm passed, a loss of power caused the pavilion to collapse onto the shuttle. The damage was repaired in the following months, and the exhibit remains open with Enterprise looking as clean as shiny as ever to this day. OMS engine boost. The shuttle's orbital maneuvering systems engines were not very powerful, but that was kind of the point. They were made to make more precise maneuvers while the shuttle was in orbit. They aren't designed to be used in the atmosphere. If the shuttle were sitting on a runway, firing them wouldn't even give them enough power to lift her off the ground. However, what they could be useful for was a small boost in acceleration during ascent, and after STS-90, they were almost always ignited partway through the launch after booster separation to give a little extra push as the shuttle made its way to orbit. SpaceX Dragon Eye. This occurred in the earlier days of SpaceX's existence before a Falcon 9 had ever been launched. SpaceX launched a piece of hardware on STS-27 aboard Shuttle Endeavour called Dragon Eye, which is a proximity sensor that uses laser imaging detection and ranging, or LiDAR. It provides three-dimensional images using LiDAR sensors, providing range and bearing information about the spacecraft and its target. The first test was successful, and Dragon Eye made a second appearance on Shuttle Discovery with STS-133. The principles of this technology would later be used to guide the SpaceX Dragon spacecrafts when docking to the ISS. Here we see a nice piece of overlap between one generation of crewed spaceflight and the next. The tail glow. You may have seen images of this before, or you may not have. I'm not sure how common they are. On low-altitude missions, the tail fin as well as the OMS pods could be seen to glow brightly, and the explanation of why is complicated. Put simply, oxygen atoms in the upper atmosphere are absorbed by nitrous oxide on the shuttle's surface, which forms excited nitrous dioxide and radiates light as it desorbs. It's a strange and rather beautiful phenomenon, and while it looks like it might be dangerous, it is in fact harmless. Shuttle in the X-37B. You may have seen the mysterious Air Force and then Space Force X-37B, an uncrewed spaceplane that performs classified missions for the Department of Defense. Little is known about what it actually does, but we can clearly see the inspiration for the vehicle. It's technically another SDLV, as its aerodynamic design was heavily derived from the Space Shuttle, giving it a similar lift-to-drag ratio. However, the connection goes deeper. The X-37 was originally designed to be carried into orbit by the Space Shuttle. Imagine a satellite in the payload bay of a shuttle in the payload bay of a shuttle. The STS program is filled with what could have beens. And there we have the payload specialist here. Now is the point where I considered making this video 2 parts. But, nah. Let's do this thing. Down we go. Expendable landing gear. I knew about this for one specific reason. While the landing gear of a normal aircraft will be reused several times before needing to be replaced, the space shuttles were not. The design of this gear was focused on working absolutely every single time, as a shuttle belly landing would be disastrous at best. As a result, the main landing gear was replaced every single flight, and the forward landing gear was replaced every 2 to 3 flights. And that is how I obtained a small piece of the Space Shuttle Columbia. A small piece of rubber removed from Columbia's forward landing gear tire after STS-52, which coincidentally also flew a payload for the university in my hometown. The Tiger II Tire Assault Vehicle. Another fun thing I didn't know about, the TAV was a small-scale model of a German Tiger II tank, which was equipped with a drill and used to depressurize the shuttle's tires if they were overpressurized. Why did they style it like an old German tank? No idea. I'm joking, it's because NASA are a bunch of dorks, really. Now we reach the namesake of this tier, Story Musgrave's stand-up re-entry. Normally, astronauts would be in their seats embracing themselves during atmospheric re-entry, but not Story, who's a bit of an odd man. He had been asked to do some filming out the back window of the flight deck on STS-80, his final flight, but he was supposed to get back into his seat. He never did, and stayed on his feet at age 61 all the way through atmospheric re-entry to wheel stop. It wasn't his first time either. He also did this on STS-6, but there's less information about that, and STS-80 is the one that's remembered. It's also very likely that other shuttle astronauts have done this as well, but again, there aren't any memorable stories about them. Let's go back to STS-27, the near miss with Atlantis inner tile damage. Mission Specialist William Shepard needs to use the bathroom, and he does so, but in the process, something comes floating out of the shuttle's bathroom. The crew recoils in horror, immediately identifying the something as feces, as such incidents had happened before with the shuttle's unusual toilet. However, a few moments later, Bill Shepard came floating out of the bathroom, approached the floating item, and took a bite out of it. He had stowed away his breakfast sausage to pull off a very crude, though funny, prank. Additionally, there's a quote somewhere from Bill Shepard in which he asked the crew to let him know when the shuttle was over Cuba because he wanted to, quote, pinch one out over Castro. The Black Knight Conspiracy Theory. Ever heard this one before? It's a whole lot of kooky nonsense about how there's a satellite orbiting the Earth called the Black Knight, and it's possibly of alien origin, and is possibly thousands of years old, and is proof that extraterrestrials are watching over us and always have been. However, the truth is far less impressive. It's a solar blanket, photographed by the crew of Space Shuttle Endeavour as it fell off the Unity module, which was being installed to the ISS core module Zarya at the time. When you look at this GIF of the debris floating away, it becomes more obvious as it changes shapes and reflectivity during its journey. STS-1 suffocation deaths. I didn't know about this, and quite frankly, it's sad when pad workers and engineers don't receive the same treatment as astronauts when tragedy strikes. 3 weeks before the launch of STS-1, the shuttle had just completed a dry countdown demonstration test, essentially a wet dress rehearsal without the wet part, and it went according to plan. However, a team of 3 technicians entered the aft compartment shortly after the test and, unaware that a gaseous nitrogen purge was still underway, almost immediately collapsed and suffocated in the oxygen-poor environment. One, John Bjornstad, died en route to hospital. Another, Forrest Cole, died in the hospital. The third, Nick Mullen, survived, but died in 1995 from long-term complications. Before she ever flew, Columbia claimed 3 lives. Over the course of the program, the shuttle had 5 different RSLS or redundant set launch sequencer aborts. These are performed automatically by the flight computers and occur when, after main engine start, any kind of dangerous anomaly is detected.
7, 6, 5, 4, and we have a main engine shutdown at T-minus 3 seconds. And the main engine let off. We have a redundant set launch signature abort.
For instance, the previously discussed STS-51F aborted due to a malfunction of an engine coolant valve. STS-41D, on the other hand, aborted at T-minus 6 due to a stuck LOX flow valve. Because the center engine hadn't ignited before the abort, but the others had, everyone really struggled to verify the state of the center engine. When the crew evacuated 20 minutes later, they were doused with water from the pad deluge system. It had activated because a hydrogen fire had started around the engines, caused by free-flowing hydrogen collecting around the nozzles. The fire was invisible to the naked eye, adding an extra danger, but the crew never went near it. Had they used the normal escape procedure with the slide wire escape baskets, they might have. Artemis 1, launched in November of 2022, is known for using a lot of old shuttle hardware. All of its main engines were procured from the shuttle main engines, and the Orion spacecraft itself uses a main engine that is converted from the shuttle's OMS engines. The particular Orion main engine flown on Artemis 1 flew 19 times on 3 different orbiters, Challenger, Discovery, and Atlantis. There isn't much more to this, it's just a nice fun fact to know that the low Earth orbiting space shuttle has, in one way, made it all the way out to orbit of the Moon. Additionally, as this iceberg is a little dated, we now know that the OME on Artemis 2 will use an OMS engine from Shuttle Atlantis, which flew 6 times between 2000 and 2002. Now a piece of the shuttle will send humans back to the Moon. As said at the liftoff of STS-135, on the shoulders of the space shuttle, America will continue the dream. The Space Lab Re-Entry Contingency. Hadn't heard of this crazy scenario. This was a situation that everyone hoped would never have to be faced, and it never was faced. In order for it to happen, first, the payload bay doors would have to fail to latch. If that happened, an astronaut would have to perform a spacewalk to manually latch the doors from the inside. Ordinarily, the astronaut would then re-enter the shuttle through its external airlock. However, in the case of a Space Lab mission, they wouldn't be able to do this. There wouldn't be enough clearance for the astronaut to re-enter the crew compartment. As a result, this contingency called for the astronaut to simply hold on tight, turn their suit down to the coldest possible settings, and just ride it out until they were fished out after landing. I did something like that in Kerbal once. It went very poorly. I'm sorry, Jeb. You may be familiar with the Nauka module, a Russian-built laboratory module installed in 2021. Shortly after its installation, the Soyuz spacecraft that delivered it malfunctioned, firing its engines and sending the ISS spinning by 57 degrees. However, you may not know that Nauka was an extremely delayed module, so much so that its outfitting work was performed back in 2010 on STS-132. The work the shuttle did continues to be relevant a full decade after it was completed. What a legacy. The RS-25 porous injector. Another thing I didn't know about. The shuttle had a lot of crazy design elements meant to assist in pre-launch operations and in ascent operations, including the extrusion process of the O-rings that led to the loss of Shuttle Challenger. One of these wild elements was the faceplate of the injector for the main engine, which was made with a porous material so that it would deliberately leak hydrogen. This was done to provide some cooling to the incredibly complex SSME engine, which remains to this day among the most impressive rocket engines ever designed. Down we go, folks. Time for STS-9999. Shuttle forever. The Challenger Pisspuck. Oh boy. Maybe the worst near loss in the shuttle program's history. In 1985, the shuttle's wastewater venting system needed to be significantly redesigned due to an incident that occurred during the re-entry of STS-41B. The low pressure in the vents that expelled the shuttle's wastewater out of it caused the water to freeze and accumulate around the vent. This resulted in a pyramid-shaped 200-pound frozen chunk of wastewater to break off during re-entry, causing 5 dents along the vehicle's body and 3 on the OMS pod. The pod's damage was so bad that a 2-foot section of tile was held on only by its wire grid backing. Shuttle Challenger was very nearly almost destroyed by a frozen chunk of urine. SSME startup valve positions. This refers to the absurd and complicated sequence of positioning for the valves on the RS-25 main engines during ignition and ascent. There's actually a far more detailed breakdown of these positions in Scott Manley's video, How the Space Shuttle Started Its Engines and Launched, and I don't want to take away from how great that video is, so if you're interested, just go watch that. Scott will explain it better than I ever could.
So the hydrogen starts flowing into the engine, but the engine is warmer than the boiling point of hydrogen, so it vaporizes. And that, on one hand, helps provide pressure to spin up the turbines, but on the other hand, the back pressure actually causes pressure waves or oscillations in the propellant flow.
RS-30 Space Tug. I'd never heard of this before, but this was basically an idea for a reusable cargo tug that would remain in orbit for long periods of time and utilize the RS-30 engine, which was derived heavily from the shuttle's main engines, and would be capable of restarting itself a significant number of times something not a lot of rocket engines are capable of doing, including the shuttle's engines. Another one of those what could have been things, an idea that could have been part of the STS program as it was intended, or as it was called internally, the Integrated Program Plan, but never came to fruition. Atlantis' missing retaining bolt washers. This is an interesting one, and something I'd never heard about. Apparently in November of 1997, Shuttle Atlantis was being carried across the country atop the carrier aircraft, and it was discovered after landing that 2 washers were missing from the retaining bolts of the shuttle's rear attach points, meant to distribute the weight of the shuttle to prevent overstressing those bolts. It was a matter of luck and weather conditions that kept Atlantis in place that day, and an accident would have resulted in the loss of both the shuttle and the carrier aircraft. SLS Stages Contract. I also didn't know this. Apparently, the Ares 1 upper stage contract from the Constellation program is the exact same contract as the current SLS Stages contract. They never wrote a new one, which means, in a way, Constellation never died at all. It just became Artemis. It took a very long walk in order to get there, but it got there. Shuttle JWST. If you didn't know, the James Webb Space Telescope was a long time coming. Its development was delayed a lot, and at one point the plan was for it to be launched aboard the space shuttle with the high-energy upper stage. However, development went on for so long that the shuttle was dead and gone for a decade by the time James Webb was finished and ready. Instead, as you likely know, James Webb was launched on the ESA Ariane 5 rocket. Well, this was a short tier. I guess the point is that there's not so much information this deep down because that's just how obscure we're getting. One more level to go, everybody. Time for Wayne Hale. Tripropellant SSME. Wow, what an idea. As you may know, most rocket engines, at least for booster stages, use bipropellant mixtures, a fuel and an oxidizer. Shuttle specifically used liquid hydrogen for fuel and liquid oxygen for oxidizer. However, there was the idea at some point during its design phase to add a third item to the mixture. Usually the idea is to spend the first portion of the flight using the more powerful kerosene or refined petroleum-1 fuel for its higher specific impulse, but later in the flight, replace that fuel with liquid hydrogen, increasing efficiency and overall performance. This would allow for a replacement for the effects of staging a rocket, which use engines optimized for low altitudes on the first stage and vacuum-optimized engines for second and third stages. However, the final design would replace the kerosene with the solid rocket boosters while improving the specific impulse with the use of Hydrolox engines throughout the flight. Which I think is fine because, quite frankly, the RS-25 engine is complicated enough without it using 3 fuels. Intentionally bumpy tiles. Didn't know about this. Early in the program's history, a number of the tiles on the shuttle's body were intentionally warped or uneven or otherwise disfigured. This was done intentionally in order to observe the different effects of re-entry on these tiles and evaluate the overall shield for changes and improvements. What all of this testing ended up concluding was that, overall, the tiles needed to be almost completely flat to maximize their benefits during re-entry. STS-35 teleprinter error. This I was not able to find much information about. All I know is that there was an onboard text and graphics teleprinter used for receiving flight plan updates, and at some point, a blocked wastewater line caused problems with this teleprinter, as well as one of the RCC thrusters. If I'm reading this very long PDF properly, there was a burning odor from the unit, and then it just shut off and started to smell worse. That sucks. STS-112's weird launch. I didn't know about this, but apparently the primary launch pyrotechnics that release the hold-down clamps just never fired. Backups took care of most of this, and the boosters are powerful enough to tear free of whatever was left, but it remains a complete mystery. They never figured out why the primary pyros never fired, and the launch was a success anyway. The Augustine Commission. This I had heard of but knew nothing about. In 1990, the Advisory Committee on the Future of the United States Space Program was requested by Vice President Dan Quayle. It was formed to evaluate the long-term future of NASA and the United States civilian space program. In the end, they recommended that the space program focus on 5 activities: space science, earth science, human spaceflight, space technology, and space transportation. Space science was to be given the highest priority for funding. It proposed a scaled-back redesign of Space Station Freedom, which would eventually become the ISS, and also proposed an unmanned vehicle to replace some space shuttle launches. It recommended the shuttle be used only for missions requiring human presence, and apparently, canceling shuttle altogether was on the table, but never happened. The shuttle program's only one-to-one reflight of a mission occurred with STS-83 and STS-94. After STS-83 reached orbit, one of its fuel cells failed. Mission guidelines require that all fuel cells be operating to continue with a mission, so the mission was cut short and Columbia had to return after only 3 days in orbit. Later that year, 1997, STS-94 would refly the mission entirely with the same crew and was a complete success. A human skull was flown on 3 separate shuttle missions. This sounds a lot more gruesome than it actually is. Do you want to see the skull? Here it is. Yeah. Not very exciting when it's held in a plastic matrix representative of tissue and sliced into 10 layers. It was used to record radiation levels and their effects on the human skull. From what I can tell, the same female skull was flown on all 3 missions. Our final tidbit is something I didn't know about. STS-133, the final flight of Shuttle Discovery, experienced something called a gravity gradient after soft docking to the ISS. This caused the vehicle to tilt 10 degrees off from alignment with the station, and the crew had to wait for this condition to pass before hard docking to the spacecraft. I'll be honest, I don't fully understand what a gravity gradient is. I think it might have something to do with uneven mass distribution, but I'm genuinely not sure. If anybody tells me in the comments, I'll pin it. And there we have it. The Space Shuttle and its derivatives iceberg, explained, I hope, in sufficient detail. I hope everybody learned something today. I certainly learned a lot. I know it wasn't a perfect system. I know it was far from it. There was a lot about the Space Shuttle that was dangerous, poorly planned, altogether ignored, or begging for redesign. However, at the same time, the shuttle was undeniably impressive. When Enterprise was first seen by the public before it had a name, the media called her the Starship Enterprise of the modern era. It was the first time that the world tried to look beyond the confines of the capsules of Apollo, Gemini, and Mercury. It tried so hard to do so very many things, and while at the end of the day, it can be argued that it fell short, many of those things it could do still cannot be repeated today. It was the single most ambitious launch system ever designed, the most complicated machine of its era, and an icon of spaceflight that will never be forgotten. The people who operated it were pioneers, goofballs, and had more courage than anyone I've ever met in my own life. The shuttle program, say what you will about it, was a little bit insane. If you enjoy this content, consider hitting the subscribe button. If you really enjoy this content, consider donating on Patreon, becoming a member, buying some of my books on Amazon, or buying some of my merch. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you over the curve, Space Cowboys.